Okay, folks, it's 7:40, so we're going to go ahead and begin class for episode 2 of the Second World War. Last time we talked about the invasion of France and made it up to about that point. I mentioned to you last class about Vichy France. Remember that Vichy France was the area of France that is not under direct military occupation, but instead under the supervision of the German High Command, with various politicians, people like that, and Nazi party figures who were administering France in the southern part of France, Vichy France, as a puppet government. Meanwhile, the other areas of France, the more populous urban areas towards the north and then the areas along the coastline, were formally occupied by the Nazi military. And so those places are going to be decidedly more strictly controlled by the Nazis versus that orange area where pretty much it's just a bunch of farmland and not a whole lot of cities are in that area. So there was less of a need to have Nazi troops stationed there. Benito Mussolini joins Hitler. Both of them declare war, and the attack begins. Italy attacks southern France while Germany is attacking northern France. This happens mid-May of 1940, after the Sitzkrieg period, and by mid-June France surrenders. And when the French surrender, a tank commander by the name of Charles de Gaulle, who was a figure of notability in French government in years after World War II. Charles de Gaulle ends up becoming the president of France. If you fly into Paris, the name of the airport in Paris is Charles de Gaulle Airport, and so Charles de Gaulle is a very famous French military / political figure in history, and he was a tank commander, and he moved to London and started what became known as the Free French movement. But we have to just be honest that the Free French movement during World War II is pretty weak. It doesn't really have the level of effectiveness as a proper military force does. And so the Free French movement is limited in its influence and effectiveness in fighting the Nazis, but there did remain a group of diehard French loyalists who resisted Nazi rule in France and did things like, almost kind of like subterfuge sorts of things. Subterfuge is like when you're creating plans, that are going to sabotage or secretly undermine the Nazi efforts. And so those are kinds of some of the things that the Free French movement would do. Sabotage and subterfuge, those kinds of things. So France falls, and Germany, after seeing the British flee Belgium in the escape at Dunkirk, simply steps right around the Maginot Line and invades France and takes it over, establishes the Vichy France government. Germany quickly subdues France and sets up a puppet government with its capital at Vichy. And then they take Paris. And so you can see this is a famous photograph of Hitler and two other Nazi commanders standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. Hitler toured Paris, and the Nazi soldiers marched every day in Paris in the morning time, and the German forces swept past the Maginot Line and took the country with amazing speed, once again using that blitzkrieg tactic. And so this is the story of France in World War II is kind of a sad one, because they get knocked out of the war real early by the Nazis. Unlike in World War I, where they fought the whole war, the French are defeated quite quickly in World War II. And here you can see a German tank that's probably a Panzer tank, rolling through the streets of a small French town. And here is another image of the German invasion. Remember that as the Germans invaded France, they also went through the Netherlands and Belgium and took those over. And so very quickly, by the time that we get to June of 1940, the Nazis are already grabbing up a bunch of territory. And they have control over a sizable amount of continental Europe already by the time that June of 1940 rolls around, and that's only 9 months into the war. This is a famous picture that was featured, I think, in either Time magazine or Life magazine in 1941. The picture was taken several months after they took Paris in the French city of Marseille. And it's probably one of the most famous pictures of World War II. It's known as the Weeping Frenchman. And this picture was taken as the French flags were being taken out of Marseille and shipped to Africa. And you know, one of the stories that you'll hear about when the Nazis invade France is that, you know, Hitler had a lot of anger. He was an angry, resentful, bitter man. And in particular, he had a lot of hostility, feelings of hostility that went all the way back to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. One of the stories that you'll hear in the documentary, it's the most, how angry does a person have to be to do this? Hitler finds the exact same train car that the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. He finds the same car. He has the car shipped, the train car shipped to, I forget where he ships it to, somewhere in Germany. And then he calls in the French administrators, makes them sit in the same place that the Germans sat in 1919 inside the train car to sign the terms of the French surrender. And, you know, this symbolically was, you know, really trying to punish the French after their defeat in the same way that the Germans were punished when the French defeated them at the end of World War I. And so lots of anger and hostility, and you'll hear the longer version of the story when you watch the documentary today, but I always think about that when I think about the French surrender. And political cartoons were made at this time. Here you can see Hitler with a gun and Mussolini with a knife to Lady Liberty, who is sitting here blindfolded, signing the terms of the French armistice, which basically says that the French will no longer be a hostile combatant in the war and are going to formally surrender. And so this is, you know, of course, a political cartoon to emphasize the hostility of Germany and Italy against France at this time. One of the most critical battles of the war was, without a doubt, the Battle of Britain. And, whoops, sorry. Mochi just knocked something off of my desk here, so I gotta put this back. Okay. So, the Battle of Britain. Here's the story on Britain. As you know, Britain is an island, and in order to get to Britain, you have to cross the English Channel. And the Nazis, of course, have planes which reach Britain, and they have ships as well, although the Nazi ships, aside from U-boats, were not used as effectively in World War II as they could have been. But the British has a formidable navy, and we've talked about that several times in class throughout the school year. So the British Royal Navy and the British Air Force, what's known as the Royal Air Force, were really, you know, when it comes down to it, at this stage in the war, after France falls, Britain's like the last bastion of hope to keep democracy alive in Europe, because as you know, even though Russia hasn't joined in on the war yet, they invaded Poland, but they hadn't declared a side in World War II. They had stayed out of the conflict. They had a non-aggression treaty with Germany that they were honoring. Russia is a communist totalitarian nation, and so Russia's not in the conflict yet at this stage in 1940. And but they will be soon enough. We'll talk about that in a little next class. But at this stage, Britain is really it. Okay, Britain's pretty much it. Denmark has been taken over. The Dutch Republic, or rather the Netherlands, has been taken over. Belgium has been taken over. France has been taken over. Austria has been taken over. Czechoslovakia has been taken over. Poland's been taken over. There's virtually nowhere left in Europe that is going to be able to effectively fight against the Nazis, except for Britain. And when France falls, Hitler turns his attention immediately to Britain, and he prepares for what ends up never happening. It's kind of historical dispute whether it was actually a plan or whether it was just a decoy, and he never really intended to do this anyway. But there was a planned land invasion of Britain called Operation Sea Lion. Okay, a Nazi operation, Operation Sea Lion, where Nazi troops were going to cross the English Channel and do a land invasion of the British. And even though that never ends up happening, the British prepare themselves because they believe it's going to happen. And Hitler wanted them to. So in reality, what ends up happening, rather than doing a land invasion, the Nazis used their Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, okay, the Nazi Air Force, led by one of Hitler's top officials, a guy by the name of Hermann Goering. And you'll see what Hermann Goering looks like in the video, but let me show you just an image of Hermann Goering really quick. Hermann Goering was kind of a heavy-set dude. Here he is at that point. This is what he looks like, Hermann Goering. Okay, one of the highest ranking Nazi high command officers, and because of his close personal friendship with Hitler, he was placed into the position of controlling the Air Force. He was the director of the entire Nazi Luftwaffe. And it is Hermann Goering's plan to bomb London relentlessly. And so the Germans begin using those Stukas, the dive bombing planes, to do daily nighttime bombings of London. And the people of London are being terrorized. I mean, it is a war zone, literally a war zone. People started leaving their surface dwellings, apartment buildings, houses, those kinds of things in London, and retreating into the London Underground, the subway system in London is this they sometimes call it the tube system, but it's a giant underground subway system, and people started sleeping in the subway tunnels as a way of protecting themselves against the daily bombings by the Luftwaffe. Now, as that is going on, of course, the British have their own air force that is trying to combat the Nazi air force, which is bombing them. Hitler never actually ended up doing a land invasion of Britain with his military, his armed forces, okay, ground forces. Britain does manage to stay free, but not without paying a significant price in the terrible amount of destruction to the city of London and other areas around London, Coventry, and then other military targets as well. All right. So the original plan was to try to completely destroy the Royal Air Force. And so Hitler ordered the continuous bombing of London and surrounding areas, and the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, was sent to protect the skies above England. Winston Churchill during this time was giving, Winston Churchill is the Prime Minister of Britain, okay? He looks like this, just so you can recognize him, Winston Churchill. All right, here he is. You probably have seen Winston Churchill before. Very, very, very famous figure, okay? And so here's an image of Winston Churchill. All right, Prime Minister of Britain during World War II. And Winston Churchill was giving radio addresses regularly to the people of London to inspire them. Winston Churchill oftentimes goes down in history as the most inspirational wartime prime minister that Britain ever had, because through the radio addresses that he was doing, he would give these speeches to encourage the British to stay resilient, to continue fighting, to take the fight to the Nazis, not to ever give up. And you'll hear a clip in the documentary today of one of these speeches that Winston Churchill gave to the citizens of England, encouraging them to bravely go about their daily business, refuse to surrender to the bombing. London, meanwhile, is turned into absolute ruins. Hitler turns to away from bombing the military targets of the Royal Air Force to increase the terror of the Blitz. What was known as the Blitz is the term that was being used to describe the daily bombings of London using planes. And the entire city of London is basically on fire, okay? And there are 57 straight days of fires and bombings by the Luftwaffe of London. And when Hitler turned away from the military targets of the Royal Air Force, which is what the initial plan was to completely wipe out the Royal Air Force, and they came close. But when they turned their targets to cities and non-military targets in order to increase the terror of the bombings, it actually opened the window for the British Air Force to make a recovery, bounce back, get organized, and start fighting the Luftwaffe more effectively. And so when Hitler turns his sights away from the Royal Air Force, the Royal Air Force bounces back and starts fighting the Nazis really effectively in the skies. And I just want you to imagine, I mean, 57 straight days of fires and bombings, okay? Just imagine a city like, say, Eastvale, okay, that was going through 57 straight days of fires and bombings. You could imagine that there would be virtually nothing left. That's nearly 2 straight months, okay? That's a long time of just constant daily fires, bombings, terror. And here you can see what London looked like as it was going on in mid to late 1940. We're still in the early years of the war here, and London is an absolute wreck, okay? Because these Nazis are just bombing it relentlessly. And after almost defeating the Royal Air Force, when Hitler changes his targets, this is considered a major error in Hitler's wartime command, because it was really looking like, for a while, it was really looking like the Royal Air Force and Britain could be defeated. But when he changes his targets, changes his tactics, the Royal Air Force is given the space that it needs to recover and then ultimately bounce back and defeat the Luftwaffe in Britain. And so the Battle of Britain is really a super significant battle, because it's closer than the British would like to admit to them being taken over. It really could have gone either way. It was a coin toss, and it could have very well resulted in the defeat of the British early in the war, before the Americans and before the Soviets joined in the conflict. And that would have been devastating. You know, that would have been absolutely devastating. And it would have made it much more difficult to eradicate Nazism and the German military in World War II if Britain had dropped out of the war and been defeated the way that France was. So Hitler is forced to call off his invasion of Britain. Whether or not, again, he actually ever planned to do that is another question, but if he did, he certainly called it off. And so Operation Sea Lion, the land invasion of Britain, never ends up taking place. And the significance is that in the future, because he was unable to subdue the British, both thanks to the fact of his own mistakes, but also thanks to the fact that Winston Churchill proved to be this really inspirational wartime prime minister, and keep the morale of the British people, the spirits high, the resilience high. They are not able to get rid of Britain as a threat. And so going forward, because Britain is continuing to fight, the Nazis in the future are going to have to guard against a two-front war, just like they did back in World War I. Remember World War I, where they had the Schlieffen Plan, where they were going to quickly subdue France and then go back over to the east and fight against Russia. Well, same darn thing is going to happen now in World War II. There's not going to be a Schlieffen Plan, but the plan to eradicate the West in France and Britain, the Western threat, fails. And Britain remains in the war. They continue fighting, and they will continue to fight against the Nazis all the way up until 1945, when they are finally defeated. But the fact that the British stay in the war is what allows for D-Day, which happens June 6th, 1944, to go into effect. I mean, we launched D-Day from Britain in the English Channel. If Hitler had taken over Britain, there would have been no D-Day. and it would have been a lot more difficult to do a land invasion of occupied Europe, occupied France in particular, if it were for the fact that Britain stayed in the war. So anyhow, Hitler was going to have to guard against a future two-front war, and it also proved that Hitler's planes could be blocked, that the Nazi Blitz, the Nazi Luftwaffe, was survivable. It could be countered, okay? Winston Churchill, inspirational British Prime Minister. Hitler's planned Operation Sea Lion never goes into effect, never does that land invasion. The British Air Force was made up of about 2,900 planes. The German Luftwaffe had nearly double that amount, 4,500 planes. But Britain, early in the war, has two secret weapons that they start working to master. One of them is what's known as radar, or ASDIC. And what the radar allowed for Britain to do was to send radio signals into the sky that would bounce off of planes, and they would be able to see on a little radar screen where the planes were coming from, the direction that they were coming from, the speed that they were moving at, how many they were, and much more effectively defend against attacking planes. So radar was super, super important, and that went for the seas as well, because they were using radar and sonar systems in their ships to identify where the submarines were underwater. And so radar was really, and ASDIC, were both very, very important technologies that the British used defensively to be able to more effectively fight against the attacking German planes. And then secondly, something known as the Enigma machine. The Enigma machine was recovered by a British ship called HMS Bulldog. And HMS Bulldog had sunk a German submarine, a U-boat. And on that U-boat, they recovered a German code-making machine known as, or nicknamed, the Enigma device, or the Enigma machine. And this machine ultimately enabled the British to decode the German military plans and know what the Germans were planning to do before they do it. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about that aspect of war is, the Americans do the same thing with the Japanese. We broke the Japanese code, and we were able to know intelligence about what the military plans of the Japanese were before they did them. And then the British had it for the Nazis. And of course, the Americans and the British end up being allied with one another and share that information with each other. But the danger about it is that if you start predicting the enemy's moves too well, if you're constantly getting ahead and defending yourself too well against what the Nazis are doing, they're not stupid. They're going to know that their code has been broken, and then they're going to change it. So when you uncover a machine like the Enigma machine, you have to be really, really careful about how you use it. Because if you tip your hat too much, if you're not really careful and you're kind of, defending too well, you're going to send the message to your enemy whose codes you're breaking that you know their codes, and they're going to change them. And so it's a balancing act. You kind of have to almost you almost have to purposefully go about doing things that are going to make the Germans believe that you had no idea what they were going to do. And that requires sometimes sacrificing some of your own equipment, putting out decoy planes and stuff like that, that where the Germans are going to feel like, oh yeah, we're still scoring well against the British. We just destroyed all these planes that they had no idea we were going to attack. Well, in reality, the British did know that they were going to attack, and they put out fake planes so that the Germans would destroy them, thinking that the British still hadn't broken the code. So, and then looks like Brendan here said, before radar, the British used these massive discs called acoustic mirrors that would concentrate sound across the English Channel into a single point. Wow, somebody knows their military history. That's awesome. Wow, that's a cool fact. Really, really, really neat. Another technology, you know, these two, radar and Enigma, were huge. Those were like the most important ones. But there were other technologies that the British developed as well. Maybe you've heard of this one too, Brendan. One of the technologies that the British ships used was technology called degaussing. And what they would do is they used an electrical magnetic frequency, basically, that would make it so the Germans would lay mines in the water. And these mines were oftentimes below the surface of the water. They had a certain buoyancy where they would only sink to about 10 feet below the water, but it would make them really difficult to see, because first of all, they're small, and then secondly, they were magnetic. So if a ship sailed by, these magnetic mines that were laid out by the German submarines in the water would float towards the sides of British ships, and they kind of looked like a sea urchin with spikes on the side of it. And once the spike touched the side of the ship, the spike would detonate the mine. And so one of the technologies that the British came up with was this degaussing technology that made it so that the magnetic mines would not float towards British ships, and they would be able to navigate through the waters without attracting magnetic mines to their ships and blowing a hole in the side of the hull. So ultimately Hitler's attempt to completely defeat Britain in 1940 by bombing them does not work. It fails. And Hitler calls off the attack of the Battle of Britain late in 1940, thinking foolishly that there was going to be no way that the British would be able to bounce back from the amount of devastation. Did random ships get blown up? No doubt they did. No doubt that did happen. But at this time, random ships, of course, were blown up, particularly in the early years of the war. There were they measure ship losses in tonnage, how many thousands of tons of shipping weight were destroyed. The British were using something known as the convoy system. And the convoy system was where large groups of ships would sail together. And each of the ships in that convoy would be looking out for enemy ships, submarines, and because you're not just sailing by yourself, you have a lot better chance of making it to your destination. But yeah, no doubt, all sorts of different cargo ships, cruiser ships, battleships, destroyers, and so on would have been destroyed or were destroyed in World War II. Did Hitler send V-1 and V-2 rockets to bomb British cities after the Battle of Britain, or did he send them during the battle? That happened later because that used the rocket technology that they didn't have yet in the beginning of the war. The V-1 and V-2 missiles get sent late in the war, like 1944, early 45, particularly for the V-2, which came later. I think that doesn't start being used in the war until very, very late. But by that point, you know, if Hitler had the V1 and V2 missiles early in the war, that would have been very, very bad. But they don't get developed till the end when he's already kind of on death's door. So they don't end up having as much, even though they're amazing weapons, they don't have a lot of them. They certainly didn't have as many of them as they had, like, planes in the beginning of the war. But nonetheless, I mean, it was a devastatingly effective weapon, and if they had been using them earlier in the war, definitely that would have been problematic for Britain. So here you can see some other images of Britain. Obviously, lots and lots of people killed and wounded in these bombings, but the British kept their spirit up thanks to that gentleman in the lower right-hand corner, Winston Churchill, giving his speeches, encouraging the British never to give up. And here is a clever political cartoon from Britain. And here you can see a line of empty chairs, a waiting room in a dentist's office, and it says A. Hitler Dentist. And all these people have their hats still hanging on the wall. Czechs, Austria, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, France, and their hats are all on the wall. They went into their appointment and never came out. And then Hitler comes out, he says, "You're next," and he's got this evil look on his face, and he's kind of holding a pair of pliers there. But you can see the British guy sitting there at the end of the chairs, and he's got his own agenda, he's got his own plan, he's rolling up his sleeves, and he's kind of hiding his own wrench behind his back there. And so this is a political cartoon demonstrating once again how the British weren't going to suffer the same fate as all those that faced Hitler before they did, and they're going to put up a fight, and they certainly do just that. So moving on to the next part here, and I'm only going to talk about this a little bit because I don't want to get too far ahead of where the documentary leaves off today, but just to give you a preview of what's coming up here, I'll talk about these next few slides. So in 1940, most of that year, Hitler is bombing Britain. In late 1940, he calls off that attack and starts developing a new plan. And the new plan that he comes up with is to invade Russia. And this becomes known as Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa. He has to prepare for this. His whole mentality is, number one, he never liked Stalin. That non-aggression pact that Hitler signed before they invaded Poland, before World War II in Europe even started, that non-aggression pact was done merely for his own security. He was not reaching out to Russia to become friends with them, to become a golfing buddy of Joseph Stalin. The Russians are communist and the Nazis are fascist, and they hate one another. It was purely for Hitler's own war plans that he reached out to Russia for the non-aggression pact so that he would be able to fight against Britain and France without their interference. But by the time that June 1941 rolls around, Hitler is continuing to increase the size of Britain. And yes, Brendan, it is the largest ground invasion in history. You know, and we'll talk all about it here. Just sit tight. We're going to get to it. Hitler's attempt at what was known as Lebensraum. Lebensraum is a German word for living room, okay? And what Hitler is trying to do is to get more land for Germany so that the German people have more resources. Okay, he's trying to increase the size of the German state by taking over new lands to the east, Russian lands. So, and the Nazis had a very poor opinion of the Russians anyway, even going all the way back to World War I. Remember that the Russians and the Germans fought against one another in World War I, and that was much to the to the dismay of the Russians, who got a severe beating in World War I and ended up having to drop out of the war, which was, of course, humiliating to them. And that's when the Russian Revolution started, which we learned all about. And so even going back to World War I, there were a lot of hostile feelings between Germany and Russia, and those are only going to get 10 times worse during World War II. Remember that Hitler had all of these ideas about racial superiority and how much better the German Aryan race was than everyone else. Okay, and you learned about that when you watched the Rise of Hitler docu-series that I had you watch, and so Hitler had this whole thing about how Russians, Slavic descent people, were inferior to Germans, and so he believed in these racist ideas against the Russians, and how the Russians were weak and they didn't stand a chance against the German military and all of these other things. Meanwhile, he's trying to take Russian lands to increase the size of Germany. But exactly the same way that the Russians fought against Napoleon when he invaded back in the early 1800s, 1812, the French under Napoleon invaded Russia. You might remember me telling you that story and how the French made the mistake of going to Russia. They get there and the Russians used scorched earth tactics, where they would purposefully withdraw their troops, pull the Nazis further and further into the Russian countryside, this time under the leadership of Stalin. And Stalin orders people to abandon their little towns, villages, and burn down everything. Kill all the livestock, burn down all the farms, burn down all the crops, and retreat into the interior of Russia, which is, of course, huge. And so Hitler invades Russia in a very similar fashion to the way that the Napoleonic troops did 115, 140 years earlier, maybe not quite that long, 115, 125 years earlier, somewhere in that area. And what ultimately ends up happening is that thousands of tiny little towns in the Russian countryside are just completely wiped off the face of the earth, never to reappear. And the Nazis get pulled further and further and further into the interior of Russia. But as you know, the longer they go fighting in Russia in the summertime, the closer they get to the winter time. And just like with Napoleon, who was hopelessly ill-equipped to handle the cold weather, the winter of Russia, the Germans in World War II are going to face some of the most historically brutal winters that Russia had ever experienced. It is going to be the equivalent of like fighting in Antarctica, okay? It is going to be beyond freezing cold temperatures, tundra type conditions, okay? Blowing snow, blowing blizzard-like conditions at times. Icy cold weather, sometimes dipping to -10, -20 degrees Fahrenheit, below zero, literally below zero, okay? Measuring temperatures in negative numbers, with wind chills going up to -50, -60 degrees, okay? Horribly cold weather in 1941 and 1942. Unlike the French, though, the French are retreating the first winter they experience. The Germans are going to make it all the way to the second winter, but that is not going to be in their favor. The longer the war goes on with Russia, the worse it gets. And so Operation Barbarossa, 3 million German troops, which to this point really had not been used that much in the war. Hitler has this massive military that hasn't really been tested that much because they've been using the blitzkrieg tactic and having very little opposition to face. And they are going to finally meet that opposition when they fight against the Soviet Union. Now, this plan, Operation Barbarossa, of the 3 million man German Nazi military invading Russia, is going to be a stab in the back to Stalin. Remember that the Germans and the Nazis had a non-aggression treaty, but Hitler basically just stabbed Stalin in the back, which frankly, to be honest with you, Stalin was probably expecting. You know, Stalin never trusted Hitler. And so Stalin probably had the idea that the Germans more than likely were going to invade at some point. Whether or not he predicted that they were going to invade when they did is another question. He may have thought that they were going to wait longer before they stabbed Russia in the back, but they don't. And in late 1940, early 1941, Hitler is making plans, and the plan that he makes is a 3-prong attack. Almost like a fork. You know how you have different prongs on a fork. He's going to take his military and do 3 different targets. One is going to be known as Leningrad, aka St. Petersburg, which is in the north. The other one is going to be Moscow, which is going to be in the center prong attack. And then the mineral mining target, financial target in the south of Kiev. And so this was going to be the 3-prong attack that Hitler uses to rapidly blitzkrieg Russia, penetrate into 3 major Russian targets: St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kiev. Now, initially, we have to understand that the German military is far, far better than the Russian military from a technological standpoint. German tanks, German planes, German discipline are all far better in their military than the Russian military. However, Russia has some advantages of their own. First of all, the Russian military is much, much, much larger than the German military. They have millions more people in their military than the Germans did. However, that also translates to millions more Russians dying in the war than Germans. There is a famous, let me see if I can quickly do this. There is a famous photograph. Let me show you this if I can pull this up quickly enough. There's a famous photograph, I'll explain it to you, of it's a before and after, okay, before and after image. And the before and after image is of a Soviet soldier who has a picture taken when he first starts the war against the Germans. And then he is one of the few Russians who made it to the end of the war. That was not common, okay? Remember that the Russians in World War I, the Russians lost about 5 million people. In World War II, they lost, and we don't really know the exact number, but the estimate is about 25 million people. 25 million people. That's the population of all of New York, all of Los Angeles, and all of Chicago added together. Okay? That's how many people, Russians, were killed in World War II, mostly at the hands of the Germans. And so you could understand why there would be such bitter, bitter resentment between the Russians and the Germans as they were fighting, and how that resentment only got worse as the war went on. But I digress. Let me pull this picture up for you. His name is Evgeny me put this up here. Images. This is a before and after image of a Russian soldier. Okay? Let's see if we can zoom in on this. Here we go. I want you to take a look at this. Okay? This is a Russian soldier on the left, and then on the right is 4 years later. 4 years. Okay? The guy looks like he's aged 20 years. Okay? This gives you an appreciation for the unbelievable level of stress and the physical toll that war takes on the body. Okay? You can look at the circles under his eyes. All right? And mind you, the Russians won. This guy lived. He didn't die. Okay? This is the effect that World War II has on the soldiers that are fighting in it. And in some cases, it completely breaks a man. You know, you'll see images when you watch the documentary of German soldiers in Russia in the wintertime who are just broken. They're just broken people, okay? Mentally can't do it anymore. And that's the reality of war on humanity. You know, we're entering into a scary time, kids, I gotta tell you. Because we're entering into a time where humans have forgotten how bad war is. And you know, all of the oldest politicians that are now serving, you know, and that includes the last administration as well. I'm not just trashing Biden, but all of the most elderly politicians serving in government right now were all born after World War II, which means that they don't remember World War II. They don't have any understanding of the devastation that the soldiers in World War II faced. And that's a scary thing, because when you lose touch with the effect that war has on the individual, when you lose touch with the effect that war has on soldiers and society, it becomes easier to go to war because it becomes glorified. Make no mistake, I bet if you talk to this guy at the time that that picture was taken, there would be not one glamorous thing that he would have to tell you about war. So keep that in mind. Never, ever, ever forget World War II, because World War II is our touchstone in history that global wars are nothing but devastating to society. So, kids, that is where I am going to leave off for today. But I encourage you to now, I'm going to put I haven't put it up yet, but I'm going to do this right now, right after I get off the lecture with you. I'm going to put the new documentary episode up. Please, please don't even do it for me. Do yourself a favor and watch these, okay? They are really good. If you didn't watch the first one, boy, missing out. I feel bad for you, okay? Definitely watch this one. The second one's a good one for sure. All of them are really good, but the second one I like. So, so please do that today. I'll post it right as soon as I finish this. If there's any questions, let me know. I know Venkata, you asked me about the test. The test is graded, but I, for whatever stupid reason, got so sidetracked putting in late work yesterday from a million different people that I forgot to actually input the test grades into Q. So the tests are graded, but they just haven't been added to the grade book yet because it just completely slipped my mind. But I will add that. Don't freak out about it. And I appreciate that. I'm glad that you think it's cool and interesting. I really appreciate that feedback. You know, I love this stuff. I just love talking about this stuff. Yeah, I know it was 75 years ago. What's your point? Yes, Venkata, there will all be, yeah, everybody's watching a new video assignment tonight. Isaiah, what's your point that it was 75 years ago? Oh. I think he meant, I think he meant looks like 40 years old. It's crazy to think about. Yeah. I mean, it is crazy to think about. You know, it is crazy to think about. 75 years ago, you know, guys, I got to tell you, story is, when I was an undergrad in college, I was studying in London, and when I was 20, this was when I was 21 years old, and it would have been in the year 2004, okay? I was 21 years old, I was living in London, and I was working with a museum known as the Imperial War Museum. And at that time, there were still a number of World War II vets that were alive. Okay, many of them have since passed away. They would be well into their 90s by this point, which it's hard to make it to your 90s. You know, not everybody gets there. But at the time, they were still in their late 70s, early 80s, and there were a good number of them still alive. And I got to talk to men who served in World War II. You know, I wrote an entire paper about interviews that I had with World War II soldiers who served in the British Royal Navy. Boy, you know, what an amazing experience to have been able to have that history experience while the people who lived it were still alive. Pretty cool, and it's such an amazingly important thing in history. When you think it was only 75 years ago, that's not that long ago. You know, in the scheme of history, that is not that long ago. But it's long enough where we're starting to get to that point where people, because they don't know anyone who was in the war, they're all dead, or because they were born after the war and don't remember it or whatever, it makes it so that people start to, you know, the war loses its value a little bit. You know, people stop recognizing how darn important it was. And so I got to tell you, you know, in my opinion, World War II is one of the most important things you can learn about in this class, not only because it's pretty recent, okay, but also because we should be doing everything that we can to prevent another war like it from ever happening. And to be honest, it would never be like World War II ever again. It would be 50 times worse just because of technology. Okay? When World War II was being fought, the nuclear bomb wasn't invented until the very, very, very end of it. Okay? Now, in a situation where there are weapons that could quite literally destroy the planet 10 times over, we have to be even more cautious to prevent something like that from happening. So, kids, that's it for me today. Go on Canvas, watch the new episode 2, do the assignment for it, and get that handed in. I'll give you until Monday to get that handed in. We'll continue with this lecture tomorrow, Friday morning. Have a wonderful day.